Hi, my name's Phil Aune. Last name is spelled A-U-N-E.
Uh, if you can, give me kind of a brief history about your work in Forest Service and whatnot.
Okay, this may take a little while.
That's fine.
First of all, I was raised in Southern California, and I knew there was better opportunities outside of the Southern California area. I became interested in forestry in high school, and I went to Humboldt State College in 1960 and graduated in 65, and started a career with the U.S. Forest Service in 1962, basically as a forestry technician looking for property corners. Most of the national forests in the West had a lot of alternative ownership from the 1862 railroad land grants, and we had to find all the property corners before you could do anything to manage the land. So that was my first job with the U.S. Forest Service. And ultimately that ended into a 37-year career with the U.S. Forest Service. I started as a junior forester on the Sequoia National Forest in 1966, and I stayed there until 1970. Then I went to the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California from 1970 to 75. And as a district silviculturist is a word, silva for the Latin of tree, Latin word for trees, and culture, silviculturist, and basically responsibilities for reforestation, stand improvement, and prescriptions for harvesting timber. And from that, I transferred to the Tahoe National Forest, or the promotion to the forest silviculturist, where I was responsible for 5 ranger districts and all of the silviculture work that happened on that particular national forest on the Tahoe. And I did that for 12 years. And then an opportunity came up, and I applied for a job with U.S. Forest Service Research, and I went to the Pacific Southwest Research Station, headquarters at that time in Berkeley, California, and my assignment was in Redding, California, where I was the program manager of the Redding Silviculture Lab. And at that time we had 4 research projects going, about 12 scientists ultimately. And we were doing everything from research on basic fire histories to fire suppression efforts, tree growth measurements, and also stand management activities. And we're doing long-term research. One of the notework efforts was we initiated a national program on national long-term soil productivity. What were the effects if you remove trees and damage the soil in terms of long-term effects on forest productivity? That study was started in the early 90s, and now has yielded monumental results after the almost 30 years of some of the initial treatments across the nation. And we were responsible for the California studies at that time. So in the year 2000, I finally retired. An opportunity came up to serve as vice president of the California Forestry Association, and that's what I did from 2000 to 2005. And there it was basically a policy job and providing advice to the forest products industry on federal forest management issues, particularly the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. Then I retired after that job, and we moved to Spokane, Washington. I took a year off, and I got a call from the American Forest Resource Council and asked me to be a consultant to observe the activities on the Okanagan and Colville and the Wenatchee-Okanagan National Forest. And I did that for another 8 years. So all in all, I've had about a 50-year career in forest management, as well as my bachelor's degree.
So are you done now? Can you relax?
Well, I flunked retirement, and I decided finally to just volunteer. Now I'm volunteering, and I've been on the board of directors of Evergreen Foundation, working with Jim Peterson ever since around 2008. And I'm also a member of the board of directors of the National Museum of Forest Service History, located in Missoula, Montana. And I'm a member of the National Association of Forest Service Retirees, where I serve as the awards chairman for the National Association of Forest Service Retirees. So it's basically a volunteer job that I have now.
You mentioned Evergreen. Have you known Jim Peterson a long time?
When I was vice president of the California Forestry Association, I started reading Jim's works with the Evergreen magazine, and I thought his perspective on management of our lands was simply outstanding. And so I've gotten in contact with Jim several times, and I heard him speak at various conferences. And then after we moved here to Spokane, Washington area, when I retired from California Forestry Association, I've gotten even closer with Jim. We've had him speak at several of our Society of American Foresters conventions here for the for the Inland Empire Society of American Foresters, and I've been working collaboratively with Jim ever since, about 2012.
Okay. Out of curiosity, you obviously know Bruce Vincent.
Oh yes, yeah.
And
I knew Bruce, and I first got introduced to Bruce was through the National Coalition of Counties, and Bruce was a guest speaker at one of their conventions. And at that time, he had just received an award from President Bush for his effort with partners, providers partnerships. Yeah, it was just an outstanding effort, and yes, got to know Bruce at that time.
well, we also interviewed Bruce, and we're going to combine that with you and then Jim. And to be honest with you, I don't know what the hell we're going to do with this stuff. You know, at this point, none of us are getting any younger.
Yeah.
And but I've known Jim for 35, 36 years. And I have, just to give you a background on myself, I have been doing forest photography and video production for 40 years and working in the forest. And seeking out people who could answer questions for me, because I'm not a forester.
Yeah.
You know, so we've done a tremendous amount of photojournalism on various issues, from spotted owls to salmon issues on the Columbia to pulling the dams out of the rivers, and and fires. Needless to say, they kind of go with the territory. So I was always seeking people like yourself, like Jim, who could answer questions. PhDs, Ben Stout, others. How does this happen? What's going on here? Why is what I hear from the Greenpeace and the Sierra Club not mesh with what you guys are saying and what I see on the ground, etc. So anyway, that's kind of how I got involved in this stuff too. So, but and this is kind of about Jim. So let me ask, what do you see as Jim's contribution to the industry?
Oh, Jim's contribution are way beyond contributions to the industry. He's a very eloquent and articulate speaker on the issues, and he brings these complex issues of forest management and into a very easily understood perspective of a historian. And he offers a lot of historical aspects and context to what's happened. And I think what Jim brings to the issue is someone who can put highly technical stuff that people such as myself will talk about and translate that into common sense words that people's words that people can understand easily. His articles are well prepared and well received. He receives high marks on his publication, his efforts from a wide variety of people. And so some of the more reasonable conservation groups, they also respect Jim for what he has to say. It's just been, he's just a fantastic guy that has brought, it seems to me it comes from his background growing up in northern Idaho and watching what happened from the mining industry to forest products industry, and his graduate work, his studies in journalism, etc. How can you bring this all together into one effort? And I think Jim's just done an outstanding job of that.
I agree, fully agree. You're familiar with some of the books he's written?
Oh yeah.
Okay. What do you think about his latest one?
Well, I've got to tell you, I reviewed it carefully and added comments, so I'm fairly biased on that. And Jim also acknowledged me in the book, so it's not a fair question because I highly support what he said. First Put Out the Fire is a treatise that is very timely, and it really does tell a lot about what the high priorities are now in the management of our forest. As a specific example, the management of the old growth forest in the Douglas fir region with the northern spotted owl classification, the biggest threat was harvesting of old growth trees. That's what came down with the review, spotted owl review, and etc. Frankly, the greatest threat to northern spotted owl right now is wildland fires, especially to the old growth forest, because as a result of the Northwest Forest Plan, the Sierra Nevada Framework, and others, the restrictions on management of old growth stands is very restricted, and now most of them are completely overstocked and they're choked with a lot of trees, and they need active forest management to help protect them from wildland fires. And that's the greatest threat, and it's not even being recognized right now by the federal agencies. If you redid the 1992 status review report that listed the northern spotted owl, their threat of fire was minimally played, and with maximum emphasis on the harvesting practices of the day. That hasn't really helped one bit in terms of protection of a threatened and endangered species such as the northern spotted owl.
Well, about 12 years ago I did a video on can we save our western forest, which was about fire. And living in Bend, we had fires going on around us. I didn't have to go 50 miles from home to cover these things. We had one in the Ochoco, we had one in the Deschutes, which were they were natural lightning caused fires that took off and went up like, gangbusters. And in interviewing the two head rangers on both districts, what was interesting to me, which I wasn't aware of, on the Ochoco, the ranger I was dealing with had an 8-foot table laid out, and he had, I was talking about
the fire, yeah,
doing videos, and one of the things that this one ranger set up as we were interviewing is had this 8-foot table that had stacks of federal regulations on them. The NEPA requirements, the late successional reserves, on, salmon requirements. And he looks at that and he says, get a good shot of this. He says, one of our problems in the Forest Service right now is all of these regulations, we're in compliance with this one, we're out of compliance with this one and this one. And he said, it's a no-win scenario. So try to do a salvage sale. He said, we had 50, 60,000 acres that burned in those fires. We're trying to salvage 2,000 acres.
right.
And then we get sued every time we try to put one of these things forward.
That's right.
And get blocked. And it said this will take 2 to 3 years, if not more. And by that time, by the time we get past 3 years, there's no value really
That's
left
right.
in the wood. So nobody's going to bid on it. And the fact that we have shut down so much of the forest that all of the industry is virtually gone now. So that tool that we had to work with is no longer there.
That's right.
And so anyway, I was quite the eye-opener as far as I was concerned.
I can only add to that, I testified in a House field hearing in Sonora, California. This would have, when I was with California Forestry. No, I was still with U.S. Forest Service research job, so it was late 90s. And at that time, during the question and answer period, I reiterated to the congressmen that were there that there were 1,178 pages of laws and regulations that affected the United States Forest Service in the late 90s. 1,178 pages. And I said, I pointed right at him, I said, you're part of the problem. That's too much. It is impossible to do to get through this. Later on, I compiled all of the documents necessary to get a project, any kind of project, salvage and or sometimes a simple harvesting job, a thinning, nothing complicated.
Right.
And it started showing you had, first of all, the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project, which was a report to Congress in 1966. It's that high. The EISs that followed the Sierra Nevada added that much height to it. Then you started with the notice of intent to the, in this case, you had to, one of the things you do with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is to determine if it's a major federal action significantly affecting the environment. If you know it's not, it's categorically excluded from the NEPA process. If you're unsure or uncertain, then you do an environmental assessment, and the environmental assessment ends with the decision called the FONSI, finding of no significant impact, or if there is significant impact, you go to the next step, you do an EIS. So in this scenario of documents, they did an environmental analysis. That was sued in federal court, and the judge said it was inadequate and they had to do an EIS in order to sue. So they added the EIS, and by the time they were done, the document stood this high on a table. I still have that photograph today if anybody wants to see it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal exercise. Then you read in the preamble of NEPA, say about 1974, one of the statements in there, the purpose of NEPA was not to provide excellence in paperwork, but excellence in decisions. And I'm paraphrasing. I might not have it precisely correct. And just the reverse has happened. It's excellent in paperwork. You can have a lousy decision, but if it sounds good, if it sounds good, it'll get approved. But if it sounds bad, it's not. So, it's just, that's what they've been, the federal agencies ever since the National Environmental Policy Act was passed. The federal agencies have been tied up in court forever, and the Forest Service early on was one of the leading agencies to be sued in the NEPA process, and it's gotten to be something that should be reformed, but it's difficult to get reforms. The only section of the National Environmental Policy Act that the Council on Environmental Quality has ever withdrawn was the Code of Federal Regulations, Article 1502.22, which was called the worst case analysis. And the worst case analysis was litigated significantly in the 90s because it came out. And there, the agencies had to assume that something would happen to them and it would cause them a worst case. And I'll give you an example. With the use of herbicides, What if a helicopter crashed? What would be the environmental consequences of that helicopter crashing with, say, a chemical involved in that? Or if you sprayed an herbicide on brush and the deer ate it, and then the people ate the deer, and then they drank the water that was coming off the watershed, what would be the worst case? And in federal court, I vividly remember a judge saying to two attorneys who were testifying at the time, one for the government and one for the opposition. And when the judge was done, he said, please, to the plaintiff's attorney, he says, please explain to me what this worst case is all about. What's going on? So the lawyer did a little bit with that. And the judge said, now, when it's all over and done, fundamentally, what's a decision maker going to do with this? And then, secondarily, isn't it possible then for somebody to come up with a worst case? And finally, CEQ saw the light of that kind of testimony from the judges, and they withdrew that particular requirement. That's the only one that's ever been modified in the original Council on Environmental Quality documents. It's still the same old stuff, in spite of all of the years. The agencies, particularly the Forest Service, has learned to write and do a good job, frankly, do an outstanding job. They win about 65% of their lawsuits under NEPA. That's not a bad track record, but it's also says a lot about the idea that it's almost impossible to be perfect on this, where the agencies can simply do a project, especially something like salvage. That's time sensitive. That has got to happen within the first 2 years. In my day as a young forester, we were laying out timber sales in the smoke to salvage the tree. And I remember one fire I was a cat boss on. I finished our shift. We caught the fire that night. Reported to a fire camp, which was across the river the next day on another fire, and they said, Phil, no, you're going to go do sale layout on that. And we started that process. We had the whole doggone thing done in less than 2 months, that from the time we started until we sold the sale. Now it takes years.
Yeah. But you compare that to industry on private land, and they're doing the same thing you guys were doing.
Yeah, and in the state of Washington, when I was a consultant up here to the American Forest Resource Council, on the Okanagan and Wenatchee, they had a big major fire, and it also burned through the Loomis State Forest, just north of Okanagan country. And the Loomis State Forest was over and done, about just like I'm talking about with the old Forest Service, and they got it all laid out and sold. And about 2 years later, working with the Okanagan Wenatchee, they finally came up with their record of decision for the environmental impact statement, and they sold 0 timber off of that. Everything was excluded by certain critical habitats that were burned up, and the best thing could have been was to restore those habitats, and that includes removal of the salvage, but they made the decision not to do anything.
No action alternative?
No action was. They had a superficial amount where they harvested the trees along the roads for public safety reason, and that's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was about the same time that I was also introduced to the Equal Access to Justice Act.
Yes.
Because I made a stupid statement, well, who pays for all this? And he kind of smiles and said, the public does. I said, how is that?
Yeah.
And he said, I'll show you how to file an appeal and we'll pay you.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. No, that's, and the worst case on that is if the Forest Service lose, they pay the legal fees. Right. And that ends up, for the plaintiffs, and that ends up coming out of the Forest Service budget. Right. And it's a double whammy. And so the difficulty a district ranger or forest supervisor has in determining salvage, what's the likelihood of pulling it off? What's the likelihood of being sued, and what's the likelihood I'm going to have to pay damage? But pretty soon, in a risk aversion society, the do nothing is absolutely what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. Um, what do you think, let's get into the philosophical stuff.
Sure.
What do we need to do in our forest? One of the things that came through loud and clear to me in reading Jim's book is that basically we got 30 years in the public forest. At the rate we're going before we lose the public forest.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
The timing might be a little bit long. With the rate we're going, we've been increasing the damage of wildland fires from about 4 million acres, almost to 10 million acres for the last 2 years. Mm-hmm. There are 193 million acres of national forest, and of course in the 10 million acres that includes BLM and other lands. But at the rate we're going, it's probably quicker than that. And then what we'll start seeing if there's continued non-action is reburns. About 10 to 20 years after the initial fire goes through, you'll see all of that wood, the dead wood, start to fall and lay on the ground, and it won't rot before the time comes before we have another wildfire. Then it gets even more exacerbated since now you have all this fuels concentrated on the ground instead of in the air. One thing with the first initial fire, most of the damage kills tree and the heat goes up rather quickly. There is a duff layer that lays on the forest, and that helps insulate and reduce the effects of wildfire. Well, that's all gone. Next time it comes through, everything's laying on the ground. So it just intensifies the ground damage, which means long-term soil productivity damage and altering the soil conditions. Excessive and exacerbated erosion, all of those things will happen as a consequence in the first fire, but they'll be even more exacerbated in the second fire that will happen. So I think our timing of the longevity of our federal forests west of the Mississippi is greatly reduced. The problem is not nearly as pronounced in the eastern forest or the southern forest of the United States. Right. They're actively using not wildland fire, but prescribed fire in Florida and other states for years, and they have a good track record. Plus they harvest their forest and they tend their forest, much like they do in Europe. And you never hear of major problems in wildfire effects in Europe, Scandinavian countries, all of that, because one of the reasons is that they're well-managed forests and they put out fires as promptly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Any idea what it's going to take to get the public involved in this?
The public involvement is in the rural part of the United States. First, let's talk by segments of the population. In the rural parts of the United States, they're actively involved already, and they're the ones that are affected. If you look at the Dixie Fire in California last year, burned almost 1 million acres of Plumas County, Lassen County, and those areas of California. The citizens of Greenville, Quincy, Chester, they're involved up their eye teeth, and they've been significantly damaged, and so that has happened. And what I see is the urban populations.
Wow.
That's the most difficult one, and I'm talking about the urban populations in large metropolitan areas, Seattle, Los Angeles, etc., San Francisco. They use the wildlands as their playgrounds, and recreation and those kind of activities are paramount in their view in the use of the forest. And rightly so. I have no objection to that. That's what part of the mission of the Forest Service is, to provide a great recreation experience. Difficult to do that in the Black Forest. It's very hard to provide that same kind of experience. We did some public searches when I was with California Forestry Association to do some background work on what people thought about their forest. And we asked some questions like, I'll give you an example. Do you favor clear cutting, as a way of managing your forest? And of course, it was only favored by about 10 to 15%. Then we added variables, additional question. Well, if you know it's reforested, does that change your opinion? If you knew the size of clear cuts were smaller, would that change? And so on. So a whole series, seeing what kind of involvement and messages that it would take to get support for clear cutting. Well, you could never get it over 50% of the population, either support or somewhat support.
Yeah.
Now, same kind of questionnaire, what about thinning? And so we asked the questions about thinning, same thing, do you favor thinning? One, if you know it reduces the effect of wildfires, would you support it? We had, by the way, we had about 80% originally, just over on the first question, do you favor thinning? So we're seeing what could we add to it. If you know it reduces fire, we'd pick up 1 or 2%. How about improve water quality? We'd pick up another 1 or 2%. What about wildlife? We know thinning improves wildlife habitat. And then finally, property damage. Does that improve that? And then the last question was, it reduced the effect on loss of human life. And when we were done with that, there's still 12% on the average of all those questions that wouldn't support thinning. That's the population that sues the United States Forest Service. They're entracted into their position and so on. In general, I think from that thinning assessment, we know we can get support from the general population if they're presented the information adequately. If your goal is to eliminate the legal and those folks that are willing to serve, no, we're never going to get them. I think the best thing is we'll meet you in court, our lawyers against your lawyers, our scientists against yours. In order to do that, though, we got to reform the courts, and there have to have some provisions where if you sue the Forest Service and lose, or if you serve under this, you have to pay court costs or damages and so on.
Yes.
And until it's equal, they talk about equal access to justice. There should be equal
justice.
Justice then, and who pays?
Right.
All this until it becomes who pays. And that's a long-winded answer that we're getting support. We're gaining support. It's not a problem in the rural areas. It's a problem in the urban areas, and how we get that kind of stuff. That's a tough job.
One thing that kind of helped that argument in Portland and Seattle 3 years ago was the fires, because all the smoke was blowing west.
Right.
And you had days in Portland and Seattle you couldn't see a block, and it stayed that way for weeks.
Yeah, and Multnomah Falls damn near got burned up, and that's the kind of icons that when people see us losing that or damaging that, that's what brings on attention. You go back to the Tillamook fires in the 30s and 40s, and when they happened, it just instantly became part of the state of Oregon's issues to solve, get on top of wildfires and reforest those lands and so on. So there's some public sentiment. Once they saw the damage, they got a lot of public action on that. We haven't quite seen the same kind of public action response that we saw with the Tillamook fires and what the state of Oregon did after those particular fires.
Sure. I photographed after the '88 fires in Yellowstone.
Oh yeah.
In the next spring, and it was interesting because that garnered a lot of support.
Yeah.
But it was in a national park, so the only thing they were really concerned about was saving buildings.
Yeah, that's right.
But yeah, it's ongoing quandrum of how do we get and keep people's attention
Yeah.
on these issues? Any thoughts on that?
I
What's the golden spoon?
I wish I had, because I would be retired in another area with a lot more resources. I've seen some very, very outstanding public relations work. Jim's being a good example, you know, and Evergreen Foundation. We had the California Forest Products Commission that was a sister organization to the California Forestry Association, run by a guy named Don Zay. And Don just did a tremendous job on public relations and the issues that the forest products industry was facing. But it's kind of similar to the problems we have with any kind of public issue. When you're talking values and needs, it goes like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that pyramid. If you're providing fundamental resources down here at the lowest level, and you don't have those fundamental resources, that becomes your major goal for your needs.
Yeah.
Then you always start striving for the next higher level. Ultimately, it's up at the aesthetics and that area. Well, that's where most of the United States is right now. We have plenty of food, lumber, water, etc. Even though there are shortages periodically, fundamentally they're sound. And as a society, we're striving for higher and higher things. And we kind of look down disdainfully at these things that are at the lower level, such as the acquisition of forest products. You compound that with the fact that the vast majority of our population has never lived on a farm or a forest or had to provide basic resources. They just assume they get them. You ask the average person, where do you get your 2x4? You go to Home Depot, you know, that kind of stuff. A classic thing. And the same thing with ag products and all of that. They're taken for granted that you're getting, until sometime as we have shortages. Well, we still haven't had shortages. And management of forests, frankly, is way up there in the aesthetics. You can see us managing forests for spotted owls, for biodiversity, and all of these wonderful concepts. Well, what does it mean to manage a forest for spotted owls? Does it mean just doing nothing? I don't think so. I'll give you a specific example of that. Dr. Jerry Franklin, eminent ecologist, was very active in the Northwest Forest development of the Northwest Forest Plan. In 1993, Congress asked us, the Pacific Southwest Research Station, to do a study of the Sierra Nevada ecosystems and the old growth forest and report on that. That became ultimately the Sierra Nevada Ecosystem Project, a 3-year project I was project manager of. And we had the scientists that we had involved were very eminent, renowned scientists. And Congress specifically said that it had to be an independent panel of scientists doing this. It wasn't to be done in-house with Forest Service research folks and so on. So we created the study, and Jerry Franklin was chosen to be the old growth ecologist on that. And the conclusion that Jerry came up with, in contrast to the Pacific Northwest, he said a series of reserves will not work in the Sierra Nevada. These forests are subject to wildfire and they will burn periodically. Conversely, he said that no matter what the Forest Service and other agencies do, they must address old growth considerations in their deliberations. In other words, when he was done with the Northwest Forest Plan, they had a series of reserves, old growth reserves. And they were large blocks of land and locked up in only to be managed for old growth forest and very little harvesting. In the Sierra Nevada, there was no such system ever put together for the entire 11 million acres of that study. And it was clear that management would be the success for sustaining these Sierra Nevada forests. Doing nothing would not help at all. So,
Yeah, interesting.
one of the current things that's going on in the discussion started with the cohesive strategy on fire suppression that was developed in the mid-90s, and as leading into what is now calling managed fire for resource benefits. And that is basically, as described in the cohesive strategy, the original 10 a.m. policy fighting wildfires has led to our current overstocking of forest. In other words, we started suppressing fires as quickly as we possibly could, as developed in the after the 1910 great burn up in Idaho and Montana, and then other fires that happened. The policy became that we would put all the resources we needed to control the fire by 10 a.m. the next day. At 10 a.m. the next day, you were to develop the resources necessary to control the fire by 10 a.m. the following day. So the idea was, if it got bigger, you had to add more resources, and prompt suppression was the key to that activity. That, in the cohesive strategy, said that was a failed policy. That fire is an active and integral part of managing our landscapes. That's true. That fire is, nobody discounts that. But now we talk about fire suppression, especially after fire season starts, mid-June, early July. It doesn't make sense to me and a lot of other people to not actively put out the fires as quickly as you possibly can. Right now, many of the mega fires, the million-acre fires that you're seeing, is a result of not promptly putting out fires when they could. There was one particular fire on the backside of the El Dorado National Forest that burned for 11 days before they put people on it. And it burned almost down to the state of Nevada before the effects were, they finally put the resources on it and put the fire out. So this issue is probably the biggest issue right now, is to convince the Forest Service they got to go back to promptly putting fires out, especially during fire season. This nonsense of not doing it is really very problematic. And I think we're starting to see the effects of that in that these communities that are damaged, you're going to start seeing a lot more lawsuits. Forest Service is going to be liable for this kind of stuff. And you get embedded in the head of a lot of these wildland fire managers the fact that they can do all this stuff, and with impunity. And what's happened to New Mexico recently were prescribed two prescribed fires, different times they were lit. And it wasn't in the wildland fire season, it was outside the season. And next thing you know, the pile burns that they started in January didn't go out, and it blew up under adverse weather conditions. And now you have the governor of New Mexico just livid with the results of that, and he said, no more prescribed burns going to happen in my state, and that kind of stuff. And so where am I going with all of this? It's the biggest issue facing us right now, is to get people convinced that we need to go back, in, especially the United States Forest Service, to prompt initial attack, especially inside the wildland fire season. And a lot of us old timers wrote a letter to the chief last year suggesting that he stop it. And this was Randy Moore, who was the new chief. And he did that in August. But there's no accountability for this. And so if somebody violates that, or what happens to them, and you just don't see that at all. And it continues to this day. And that's the problem.
Well, we need to use the tactics that Governor Kate Brown used in Oregon on the Beachy Creek fire.
Oh,
And one of my customers, Frank Lumber, is right next door to um, Frere's Lumber, and they both lost, a good chunk of timberland. They knew a wind event was coming from the east, 3-4 days in advance. She ordered everything on the ground. She told the state forestry people, Ian and Sandiam, that if they were caught out working on the fire, she was going to fire them, throw them in jail, pull their retirement income and whatnot. Now, that's what we need to use on the other side.
Yeah.
And I've had Forest Service people on fires tell me, because I've covered a lot of fires, and say that we can't get any management done on these forests. We get sued, we lose the lawsuit, we end up using up all of our budget on litigation.
Yep.
And have nothing left over to do anything, and then what's left over, we can only use it for fires. So
That's right.
and as one guy said, we got a problem out here. The only way it's going to get solved is by eliminating the problem. And if it doesn't burn up on its own, we're going to light it up. And that was,
That's really a sad, incredibly sad state of affairs. The only thing you can do is burn it up.
Yeah.
When you think about that, with all of the intelligence we have now and capabilities, I think, for all the way from all the modern technology that we have available to the changes in fundamental knowledge that we've gained from research, long-term research. One of the things the Forest Service has done that's very, very good is they established a very good research branch.
Right.
Yeah, and it was a co-equal with the management branch, but it was separated so that when I was with research, one of my colleagues called it, we were critics in green underwear. That we worked for the same organization, but we had the right to be critical, became based on the science that we knew at the time. And we've gained so much knowledge and we're not using it. That's the sad part. The idea of logging with steam donkeys went out years ago. The idea of all you had was tractor logging and high lead cable operations has gone out years ago. And we got incredible technology now. Even on steep lands, they've got machines that can walk on the ground literally and pick up logs on very steep ground with doing minimum damage that we only dreamed about when we were youngsters in the Forest Service. And then to not use that capability and to rely on something like fire in the middle of August to do resource management is just completely insane.
It is.
The other part that's really fascinating to me, and that's a member of the Society of American Foresters for over 50 years now, part of my concerns are what happens on our private non-industrial forest lands. And we see that our private non-industrial partners and friends, they'd love to use fire, but they can't because of the liability risk. They know the liability. So the best a lot of them will do is burn some piles.
Yeah.
But occasionally they'd like to do a prescribed fire and burn their property under controlled conditions. And they, for the most part, they can do that relatively easy because they're not big time. They're smart enough to know not to do it in the middle of fire season.
Right.
And so on. So if it's so, and none of them do it though. And at conferences, it becomes the number one thing. The use of fire on private non-industrial lands becomes a subject for discussion all the time. Nothing gets resolved because of the liability issue. The United States Forest Service, people that are lighting these fires, if they were personally liable, they'd do a heck of a lot of different things, I'm sure. They'd be just like the private landowners. They couldn't afford the risk of doing that. And until we do such time as change that around a little bit, especially for the misuse of that. When you look at the Cerro Grande fire of 2002 in New Mexico that damn near burned up Los Alamos, that was a prescribed fire that got out of control. Yeah, from the Bandelier National Monument. Lewiston fire in this would have been about the late 70s or somewhere around there, Lewiston, California. Bureau of Land Management set off a fire in July. Dang near burned up the town of Lewiston. And then you have these in New Mexico and so on. These are prescribed fires that are being lit under supposedly conditions that have been adequately described. How in God's green earth can you allow wildfires to burn and increase the size of those rascals in the middle of August when, just like you were talking with the Sandy Am conditions and the winds coming up,
Yeah.
it just blows the mind. You can't. Remember the old Alan Funt show, Am I on Candid Camera?
Yes.
And I feel like that at times. Am I listening to people that really understand what's going on?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. Well, like you, the problem is the litigation has gotten out of control
oh yeah.
in the courts, and it's hard to do one thing without subsequently doing something else simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're just banging your head against the wall. So,
Yeah. I grew up before NEPA. I started working full-time in 1966, and it wasn't until 74 when NEPA was passed, and we did some of our first environmental documents at that time. No EIS, environmental impact statement, would be required for like a timber management plan for an individual national forest. Doing the timber sale, that was all done with environmental analysis and everything. We did lots of them. And we didn't know what we were doing. We were just reading the rules, and the rules said to do X, Y, and Z. So we discussed that stuff.
yeah.
And so on. But it started getting more and more complicated. And in contrasting what we used to do before we had pre-NEPA and what we did afterwards, we didn't do anything close to what we did before. Because every time you wanted to do something that we thought as professional foresters was right, and we'd show you examples, that was the kind of stuff that people started getting after us about, you know.
Yeah.
And so on. So it just got to the point where the frustration started happening. And I spent the latter part of my career from 74 clear through the time 2000 working on major EISs. And then every project we did, it seemed like we'd end up in federal court. It's one way or the other. Especially on a forest like the Tahoe National Forest. We were under a lot of litigation. We did one of our very first environmental impact statements for the National Forest Management Act planning rule, which came out in, when was that, 76? We were one of the first early forests to go out. New York Times did a full-blown study on us. The Tahoe National Forest is going to be clear-cut, you know, and all this. Lake Tahoe. Well, we were outside of Lake Tahoe.
Yeah.
In all of this, but the public comments, we got like 11,000 public comments. It was just monumental. Most of them were a response to these kinds of generalized allegations in newspapers and so on. The hype, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, I know. So
One other story that may be relevant, it relates to research, if you've still got time.
yeah.
When I moved to research in '87, we had an experimental forest called the Blacks Mountain Experimental Forest in Northeast California.
Yep.
On the Lassen National Forest, 11,000 acres.
That's burned up now, isn't it?
No, it's fine. Swain Mountain Experimental Forest burned up in the Dixie Fire.
Okay.
That's a different one. It's close by.
Uh,
But the fire was threatening blacks, but it didn't get to it. They finally stopped it. Okay. In the late 80s, there was a very popular thing going around about managing forests for biological diversity. So we got a whole bunch of scientists together in a room and said, okay, if we had to manage for biodiversity, how would you go about doing that? And we got all kinds of different answers. So we formed an interdisciplinary science team. In the early 90s, we came up with an experimental design. We wanted to see that the things that we actually do to manage forests: cut trees, graze cattle, and apply fire. Those are basically the three things we do in forest management. There are others, but they're not as important as that. So there was two different distinct research thinning treatments. One called for high structural biodiversity. Everywhere you looked, you could see 3 or more layers of trees. Contrasted that to a very simple forest where there was only one story of trees, one set of trees that you see very uniform across the landscape. And this was put out on 250-acre plots. It wasn't small plot work. Then we split those plots and we said half will be burned and half will not be burned, followed by prescribed fire. And that was further subdivided by grazing and no grazing. All of those plots were put out in the Black Mountain Experimental Forest in the early late 90s, and the broadcast burning was done. Then at 2002, a wildfire occurred in the Black Mountain Experimental Forest, right outside of it, and it hit all of these research treatments.
Okay.
And part of it also burned into the Lassen National Forest, right adjacent to us, in an unthinned plot. 100% of the trees killed. Right next to that was one of our thinning treatments on 250 acres, and it was where we had high structural diversity. Within 25 feet of the line there between the unthinned and the thin, a crown fire that burned over here became a ground fire. We lost a few trees on the edge, and it was a ground fire that moved its way through the forest and didn't damage that. When it reached the unthinned area adjacent outside of that first treatment, it went back up and you started seeing fire occurring. Then it burned on and it hit another treatment plot. Every treatment plot had 90+% survival of the trees. And that was a fire that occurred in late August, less than about 5% fuel moisture content. And of all of the fuels, and that included the heavy fuels, and kiln-dried lumber is roughly 15% moisture content, to give you a difference on that. And what that shows is what's possible in forest management. And it was kind of the accident that happened in the lab, kind of like a scientist that has like in a Gothic movie, black and white, and got a beaker here, and he drops something in there, and he tasted the perfect martini came out of that, something like that. Well, this accident happened, and it hit all this, and it really showed what could happen. There's lots of anecdotal studies that show that active management really does reduce wildland fire. In fact, it doesn't necessarily stop them, but if you can reduce the impacts where you don't kill all of the trees and so on, that would be great. Prescribed fire does that too. And so there's lots of evidence of that. I thought I'd like to kind of close with that. There's a hope for that. And we've got all kinds of slides and so on of a demonstration of this. As a matter of fact, when I was with California Forestry Association, we developed a story on this in one of our articles, and that was posted in the House Resource Committee. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. He was a congressman from Stockton, and he was chair of the House Resource Committee at the time. He posted it in the Resource Committee. It was really good. Anyway.
I've got 250,000 images in our stockfile, and I've got lots of examples of just what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, and in some cases on various fires, that when it dropped to the ground, it came into the managed cut thinned area, hand crews could put it out.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
Got Gil's successor was Dave Bischel.
Okay, and I knew Dave.
Dave was just when I worked for him, he was just a first-class boss, one of the best ones I ever had.
Really?
Just a great guy, and it was really a pleasure to work for those guys. It was fun after I worked for the Forest Service for 37 years, and we had a tour of Black's Mountain Experimental Forest, and Dave Bischel and a guy named John Hoffman, who was the federal guy, they came up for the tour. So we gave us a tour of what we were doing with the biodiversity studies, long-term soil productivity. About a week later, Dave called me up and said, "Hey Phil, we're flying a vice president for federal programs. Would you be interested in?" I said, "Dave, I pea green." I said, "I haven't never thought about it working for anybody else."
Yeah.
I said, "Give me a chance. Let me go talk to wife and family." I said, "I'll get back to you." So he said, "Well, never mind. I'm going to fax you up the application." Fine. So we went and did a war council with the family, and they said, "Well, I had 37 years. I was eligible to retire." I said, "Let's try it." And a handshake deal. And it was great. It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have always appreciated, this industry by far, they're honest, they're sincere, they're good people.
Oh, absolutely.
They're people you're proud to call a friend. And, I looked around and there's damn few other industries out there, or groups, that you can trust, like these guys.
Yeah.
So.
The only stock traded company we had left in California Forestry Association when I joined was Pacific Lumber.
Okay.
And everything else was family.
Palco?
Yeah, Palco. And everything else was family-owned business. Even Red Emerson was family-owned business. And you get to meet, just like you said, it was... and you have a handshake contract.
Yeah. Millions of dollars worth.
You go with it, and so on, and so you see that's the way they do business, and that continues. And the whole salt of the earth people.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm proud to be associated with them. Yeah.
I have too.
Yeah.
I'm very proud. So.
I can honestly say that my time with the Forest Service was great, but I'd never work for them today. It's changed so much. Right. We lovingly called the Forest Service the outfit.
Yeah.
The outfit is dead. And what's there now, I don't know. The mission is gone.
Right.
They can all say caring for the land and serving people is the mission. Frankly, that should be switched around. Serving people by caring for the land. Yeah. And that changes the whole perspective around. And there's very few people now that in the Forest Service that actually know anything about forest management.
Right.
Yeah.
Back in the spotted owl days, and moving forward through that, I photographed, I don't know how many nesting pairs of owls. I only had 2 photos in old growth. All the rest were managed forests, and many of them were within sight of old growth forest. But there was, and I can't remember who the guys were, I can see faces, but a couple of guys that were, well, in fact, they were taking retirement because that's when Clinton was offering the early out plan, and guys are saying, "Yeah, let's get out of here." And they kind of looked at each other and said, we kind of got the best years of the Forest Service, didn't we? And, yeah. So.
We had California spotted owl came up under my watch with CFA and working with Sierra Pacific Industries. With their 1.4 million acres they had at the time. A guy named Ed Murphy, their chief planner, he had inventory plots every 4 acres. And then for every spotted owl nest that was outside of this grid of inventory plots, they would go out and inventory exactly what was around that spotted owl nest. And so in the question of what spotted owl habitat really looked like, we ended up looking at SPI data, because all the Forest Service had was aerial photo data, which was very unreliable at the time. So, but when you looked at Ed's data and SPI, you looked at the 4 acres, and the nest was over here. Okay, they go, okay, what's the 4 acres immediately surrounding that nest? What does it look like? And so on. Then you go to the next set of plots. What does it look like? Does it change? And so you could keep going out further and further and see what kind of environment spotted owls really needed. Well, the nest tree was described as anything greater than 32 inches was the general size of the tree. Because there's big trees around there.
Yeah.
And the nest site had to have, and based on those first set of plots around it, about 60% crown closure. There had to be 2 layers. And that went out to the size of 18 acres was the maximum size of that. Then, if you looked at the next set of plots, it started looking at the general forest.
Right.
Those characteristics for the nest site only lasted for the first 18 acres and all that sets of plots. And that data was presented to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service late in the listing process. But it changed the listing. California spotted owl's never been listed.
Really?
Yeah. Mexican owl's been listed.
Yeah.
And the northern owl.
Northern spotted owl.
We finally had data, real data, to show what the nest sites look like, just like you're talking about. All that young growth stuff. So where were we? Spotty owls.
Out of curiosity, did you ever know Lowell Diller?
Oh, I knew Lowell. Lowell was one of my favorite wildlife biologists. He was a great guy.
Mine too, yeah.
Yeah, with the...
He introduced me to the spotted owls down there when they first started identifying them. And,
yeah. Lowell was also very instrumental in the Pacific Fisher debates, because they had the highest, Simpson Timber Company, Green Diamond, had the highest density of Pacific Fishers found in the United States. And it was all in second growth and third growth redwood stands. And Lowell figured out all their nesting and feeding needs and everything, and they could provide it by their forest management. Yeah, those guys, there was another guy, one of my classmates, Jim Brown. He was with Green Diamond. He was one of their chief foresters. And then Neil Ewald was...
Wasn't Jim a vice president?
Yeah, yeah. Jim was a vice president.
I knew Jim.
We were roomies in college.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. Where'd you go to college?
Humboldt State.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, we had good times there. But yeah, we almost convinced Fish and Wildlife Service on the Pacific Fisher to reintroduce them into the Sierras using the excess population from Simpson's land. And working with Lowell and Ed Murphy and others of the industry. We had lots of good meetings, but what we insisted on was from Fish and Wildlife, was if the Pacific Fisher ever got listed, that they would be held harmless. And they would get relief on that.
Okay.
And then I retired in 2005. It hadn't been resolved. And I got a note from my buddy Ed Murphy about 10 years later that the Fish and Wildlife finally resolved that, and they said fine. And they reintroduced Pacific Fishers to the Sierra from Lowell's population.
Okay,
and you would appreciate that.
Yes.
That story.
Oh yeah.
It's a great one, and it to me that provides a lot of hope for these threatened populations. Sure. Not just locking them up. What can we do to actually improve the habitat and keep them managed. Red cockaded woodpecker in the south is
Right.
another story, success story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're running down to the end of our.
Well, we better quit, otherwise we will be here another couple hours. Let me call my, while you're wrapping up, I'll go call
yeah.
my wife and she's gotta call this guy back.